Trump backed down with Trump's sudden announcement of a 90-day suspension of global tariffs, reducing the export tariffs of the vast majority of countries back to 10. The major U.S. stock indexes soared by more than 10% within a day. Such volatility gives an impression that the U.S. stock market is taking on the characteristics of the Chinese share market. However, despite his backing down, Trump's tenuous governing legitimacy is based on the incitement of populism. This dooms him to be unable to completely repudiate tariffs. Otherwise, what would come to an end along with the tariffs would be all of his credibility. Therefore, the tariff policy of Trump's team inherently contains the dual characteristics of compromise and stubbornness. This is why we can observe that while Trump made concessions, he also blatantly targeted China. Not only was China not included in the list of countries with suspended tariffs, but the United States even escalated the situation further by imposing an outrageous tariff increase on Chinese exports to the U.S., raising it to a staggering 125%. At this point, this farce has long exceeded the scope of what could be called a trade war, and is increasingly resembling a childish game. Trump, a person who values face so much, and who won the presidential election by advocating tariffs, attaches great significance to tariffs for his political life. He would never give up the global tariff policy unless it was absolutely necessary. So, what on earth could have caused Trump to back down at the last moment? Firstly, the top U.S. financial tycoons intervene. If Trump could choose to ignore the dissuasion of Silicon Valley and even Elon Musk regarding tariffs, he had to seriously consider the warnings from the deeply entrenched financial tycoons in the United States. Yesterday, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, a heavyweight figure on Wall Street, publicly stated that under the tariff war model, it was not a matter of whether a financial crisis would hit the United States, but rather how rapidly it would arrive. When such a half-threatening and half-warning statement comes from the head of a top financial tycoon, its weight is completely different. Even if Trump is stubborn, he knows who in the United States he cannot afford to provoke, and whose words he must take seriously. The main reason why the financial tycoons could no longer hold back was that, under Trump's bewildering actions, the volatility of the global financial market had been significantly amplified, and it had even seriously threatened the economic security of the United States. As century-old giants rooted in this land, the U.S. financial tycoons could not stand idly by and watch a collapse occur in such a ridiculous and stupid way. What signals did Wall Street detect? Let's go back to Monday this week when the U.S. stock market plummeted before the opening. At that time, the prices of gold, crude oil, and U.S. Treasury bonds also dropped simultaneously in a rare occurrence. Generally speaking, when the U.S. stock market declines, the prices of safe haven assets such as gold and U.S. Treasury bonds will rise, which is known as the stock bond seesaw effect, a well-known common sense. However, this abnormal market performance seemed to be replicating the collapses of the U.S. financial market during the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008 and at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. When safe haven assets and risky assets collapse simultaneously, it often indicates that the financial system is already standing on the edge of a systemic risk cliff. However, in the face of a plethora of news and rumors, the attention of the vast majority of the media and individuals was entirely drawn to the details of the tariff policy. Just like in 2020, when the whole world's attention was focused on the number of COVID-19 infections, they were completely unaware that the crisis in the U.S. financial market was approaching rapidly. Trump could pretend not to care about the obvious ups and downs of the stock market and stubbornly claim that this was a necessary price. However, he had to seriously consider the huge risks brewing secretly. Since Trump announced the content of the tariff sanctions last Wednesday, and with more details being released on Thursday and Friday, it can be said that throughout the entire weekend, the eyes and hopes of the whole world were focused on Trump alone. Everyone was expecting him to show signs of relaxation, or at least demonstrate an attitude of communication and negotiation. However, Trump remained silent and leisurely went to play golf for 2 consecutive days. Finally, on the Air Force One on Sunday, when facing the camera, Trump said a sentence that the capital market, I don't want anything to go down, but sometimes, you have to take your medicine to get better. The underlying meaning was that the fluctuations in the stock market would not affect the arrangements of the tariff sanctions at all. However, at that time, he probably did not expect that 3 days later, he would be in a hurry and with a face full of humiliation, urgently suspending the tariff policy. Of course, that's a story for later. As soon as Trump's words fell, the Nasdaq Futures Index in the United States almost collapsed. A massive amount of sell orders almost caused the futures index to circuit break. In the last few hours before the opening of the US stock market on Monday, almost all investors around the world held their breath. And Trump, the only one with the ability to save the market, still remained indifferent. As expected, the US stock market opened with a huge decline of about 5% that day. The continuous bloodbath for 3 trading days had plunged the entire market into despair. Every stock was crowded with investors frantically selling their shares. The stock market plummeted straight down without encountering any decent resistance. However, a turning point occurred when everyone had lost all hope. Shortly after the opening, a piece of news emerged that Trump was considering suspending tariffs for 90 days. At this time, regardless of whether the news was true or false, under the stimulation of this information, the US stock market made a miraculous recovery. Stepping on the corpses of short sellers who were forced to close their positions, it instantly reversed the situation. Although this news was officially refuted by the White House just 7 minutes later, the terrifying amplitudes of up to 10% twice during that period were sufficient to prove that the US financial market was in a state of extreme panic, where any minor sign could be magnified several times by the panic mood. And ultimately, it was powerful enough to shake the entire global financial system. Under the tariff war, the tense atmosphere permeating within Wall Street has become an amplifier for the price fluctuations in the US capital market. And while the stock market was plummeting, gold, the world's risk warning indicator, was also ringing loudly. The simultaneous decline of gold and the US stock market, this anti-common sense phenomenon, frequently appeared as a precursor to the stock market circuit breakers in March 2020. The underlying principle is not actually complicated. When hedge funds need to replenish their margin due to the significant decline in the stock market, they are forced to sell gold and government bonds with good liquidity in order to obtain precious working capital. It is precisely the stampede-style selling that has led to the simultaneous plummeting of the US dollar, gold, US Treasury bonds, and risky assets, causing the market liquidity to drop to rock bottom in an instant. The price of gold has dropped by 8% in just 3 days, which is a rather significant decline for gold. At the same time, the total amount of gold futures sold has exceeded 50% of the historical level for the same period, which is an extremely oversold state. And the only entity that could drive down the price of gold in such a short period of time is Wall Street. These data actually indicate one thing. In the first hour of the opening of the US stock market on Monday this week, the US financial system was experiencing a liquidity depletion crisis comparable to that at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. A familiar scene occurred before the stock market circuit breakers in the United States in the early days of the pandemic. At the beginning of 2020, driven by the surging demand for safe haven assets due to the spread of the pandemic, the price of gold soared to a peak level of nearly $1,700 per ounce. However, in mid-March, when the pandemic began to spread in North America, the US stock market that experienced 4 circuit breakers drained all the liquidity in the market. The market was filled with fund managers and investors constantly searching for cash to replenish their margin. All kinds of transactions on Wall Street, including short-term financing transactions such as repurchases, had to be settled daily. Those with money to pay the bills would survive, and those without would go bankrupt. All players were treated equally. Therefore, we saw that at the same time, gold was frantically sold for cash. In just 10 days, the price of gold plummeted by 15%. This sense of déjà vu reminds us of a warning from Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve. When gold begins to betray its safe haven mission, it means that the financial system is already terminally ill. If the abnormal decline in the price of gold is a warning of the risks in the US financial market, then the decline in the price of crude oil is the death knell for the US financial market. Affected by the pessimistic economic expectations brought about by the tariffs and dragged down by the news of OPEC+ significantly exceeding production expectations, the international crude oil price plummeted by 13% within 2 days. Tariff barriers have caused the global manufacturing industry to face great uncertainties, and the expected impact of the collapse of the crude oil demand side due to the lack of confidence is more devastating than the impact of increased production on the supply side. When gold and crude oil plummet simultaneously, it often indicates that the financial system has entered a death spiral. The painful memories of the pandemic period tell us that this double blow will trigger 3 fatal chain reactions. Firstly, the collapse of commodity prices will lead to the deterioration of the balance sheets of related enterprises, forcing banks to tighten credit. Secondly, the liquidity crisis will spread from the commodity market to the bond market, pushing up the overall financing costs of enterprises and even countries. Finally, the panic mood will break through a certain critical point, triggering a full-scale sell-off in the stock market. And all of these have shown clear signs in the past 2 days. The current situation in the United States is extremely similar to the catastrophic scenario in March 2020. Now that the prices of gold and crude oil are both diving, the credit default swap CDS spread representing the credit default risk of energy enterprises has expanded to 90% of the level on the eve of the 2020 crisis. This means that in the US financial market, sensitive funds have already begun to be extremely worried about the survival of international crude oil and US energy enterprises. This implies that the risk issues in the United States are fermenting secretly and have a tendency to spread to the energy sector and even the entire manufacturing industry. By then, it will not just be a financial crisis, but an economic crisis. What's more dangerous is that the Fed's toolbox for rescuing the market is almost depleted. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet amounts to a whopping $7.4 trillion. On the surface, it seems that there is sufficient ammunition. However, $4.26 trillion of U.S. Treasury bonds and $2.22 trillion of mortgage-backed securities (MBS) assets are already deeply locked in long-term assets and are difficult to be quickly converted into liquidity. In contrast, as a tool for regulating short-term liquidity, the scale of overnight reverse repurchase has plummeted from its peak of $2.3 trillion in 2023 to less than $400 billion currently. This is equivalent to the fact that the pool of available funds for the Fed to regulate the liquidity of the money market has evaporated by 83, making it unable to effectively absorb or release fluctuations in short-term liquidity. This contradiction between a huge stock and a depleted flow is like the dilemma of a reservoir that contains a large amount of stagnant water but lacks water pipelines. In layman's terms, the positive influence that the Fed can exert on the market has been much reduced compared to before, and the last straw that broke the camel's back for Trump was the almost out-of-control U.S. Treasury bond market in recent days. Everyone has been speculating about what factor would force the U.S. government to decide to suspend tariffs. Was it Congress, the president's advisors, business leaders, the judicial system, or something else? Now, we may have gotten the answer closest to the truth, which is the U.S. Treasury bonds. This Treasury bond system, with a scale of up to $36 trillion, has lost its safe haven function due to violent fluctuations and is on the verge of collapsing under Trump's actions. As mentioned earlier, the abnormal scarcity of market liquidity has led institutions to sell U.S. Treasury bonds to obtain cash for self-rescue. In addition, foreign central banks such as the Bank of Japan are also selling U.S. Treasury bonds to obtain U.S. dollars, ready to intervene in their domestic exchange rates at any time. All these factors combined have formed a huge wave of U.S. Treasury bond selling. The scale of U.S. Treasury bond selling this week is already very close to the scale during the circuit breakers at the beginning of 2020. This has directly caused the yield on the 10-year U.S. Treasury bond to soar from 3.9% to around 4.5% all of a sudden. There is a reasonable inference that one of the purposes of the tariff stick wielded by the radical Trump was to deliberately create a recession to force the conservatives, represented by Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, to cut interest rates, thereby alleviating the interest expenditure of the federal government. If the operation is appropriate, it may be possible to save an amount equivalent to the military expenditure every year. However, the current reality is that Trump has completely lost control over Treasury bonds and interest rates because the actual situation is making things run in the opposite direction of what Trump expected. U.S. Treasury bonds are being sold due to market stampedes, and as the prices decrease, the interest rates are getting higher and higher, and this will push up the interest expenditure. Eventually, not only will it not reduce the U.S. fiscal burden, but it may even further increase the fiscal burden. In addition, the continuously depreciating U.S. Treasury bonds are, in fact, like a noose, gradually cutting off the space for the United States to stimulate the economy with fiscal policies in extreme future situations. This is what the market is most worried about. The expected poison brought about by Trump's chaotic and irrational tariff policy will not only increase the volatility of the financial market, but also accelerate the flight of funds from all financial assets. It is equivalent to squeezing the liquidity even more severely when the financial system is already close to running out of liquidity, which is like playing with fire in a paper house while turning off the faucet at the same time. If not careful, it will really burn down the old house, that is the United States, completely. From Monday to Wednesday local time this week, the U.S. stock market has been experiencing epic fluctuations of 6% to 12% for 3 consecutive days, which has proven that the current liquidity crisis, asset selling, margin calls, and the formation of a spiral of more selling are gradually taking shape. Once the mood gets out of control at a certain moment, the U.S. financial market is highly likely to repeat the avalanche scene. In March 2020, Trump's farce once again confirms the saying that most policies are not the result of careful planning, but rather a last resort. Trump has always emphasized to his voters that what he is doing is a revolution, and that there will be some pain. But he is wrong. A revolution is not just about some momentary pain. A revolution requires smashing everything and rebuilding civilization on the ruins. This process not only requires enduring long-term pain, but also involves bloodshed. There is no revolution or reform that does not involve bloodshed. It is a fantasy to expect that just by closing and opening one's eyes, the stock market will complete its adjustment and the manufacturing industry will return to the United States. Trump's demands and strategies have from the very beginning been based on a series of impossibilities, and the entire expectations of his supporters for him can almost be said to be built on such illusory promises. Because the essence of the MAGA group is nothing more than a group of the old and the young, whose souls still remain in the last century. They are not the working people in Asia. What they fundamentally want is not to get rich through hard work, but to get rich easily. And this group of people is precisely those with a low-risk preference, who are the least able to withstand fluctuations in the quality of life and the collapse of the financial system. The change of public opinion may happen in an instant, and this also determines the vulnerability of Trump's policies. Because Trump himself has no solid guiding ideology and no solid theory to support him. The only motivation driving Trump to challenge the whole world is the fluctuating and illusory approval rating. Just like the stock market, it was under the overwhelming pressure of financial risks that Trump and his team chose to make a partial retreat. However, in order to maintain his approval rating among the MAGA supporters, to uphold the rationality of the tariff strategy, and to conform to his invincible and noble image, Trump can now only target China, a country that refuses to admit its mistakes obediently and dares to resist and engage in a one-on-one showdown. Moreover, he hopes to recoup all the tariffs that he failed to impose on other countries from China. But the United States will surely stumble this time. At the intersection of the long river of history and the changes of the times, we can observe that the China-US game presents two completely different strategic approaches. The short-sighted actions of the Trump administration, which used populism to wrap its policies and maintained its power through tariffs, are like a trapped beast, scurrying around in a hurry in the cracks between financial capital and political intrigue. The so-called America First tariff stick has ultimately become a desperate measure that is like quenching thirst by drinking poison. This strategic vulnerability, established on the anxiety of the election cycle, has been fully exposed in the face of the financial tsunami of the simultaneous plummeting of gold and crude oil and the surging wave of U.S. Treasury bond selling. And Trump, who is in a panic and desperate, is facing the Chinese nation, a nation that has risen without relying on the decline of others. The United States may not have engaged in a battle with a nation that is indomitable and refuses to kneel for a long time. The last time was 75 years ago, at the foot of the howling Changbai Mountain. What was the slogan of China at that time? If we win, we'll keep fighting for 3 more battles. If we lose, we'll go back home and farm the land. After all, we come from the land and will return to it. We won't suffer a loss either way. Even if we die, we'll strip a layer of skin off those so-called big shots in the sky to vent our hatred. Let the Americans fight for as long as they want, and we'll keep fighting until we achieve complete victory. This is a contemporary interpretation of Chairman Mao's strategic thinking. The Chinese people are no strangers to tough times. What the Americans should be afraid of is that they can't endure such hardships. There is a sentence that has always deeply moved me. 5,000 years ago, the Chinese people faced the floods head-on, just like the Egyptians. 4,000 years ago, we cast bronzewares, just like the people of ancient Babylon. 3,000 years ago, we pondered philosophy, just like the Greeks. 2,000 years ago, we were as brave and skilled in warfare as the Romans. 1,000 years ago, we were as wealthy as the Arabs. And now, we are competing on the same stage as the United States. For 5,000 years, the Chinese people have always been on the world stage and have never left. However, the opponents have changed several times. The Chinese nation's achievements today are definitely not solely based on the kind of calculations for maximizing interests in the capitalist world. Instead, it is that unyielding determination to go all out and confront challenges head-on at the most critical moments. Well, my friends, that's all for today's topic. Thank you all for watching and for your likes and support. See you next time.